I am here with my husband, Watcher Dev. Who have you brought us today?
Evan Ross Katz.
Katz was one of Great-Granddaddy's favorite musicals. This is spelled with a K. K. Yes, K. No, I mean OK. Ah. Watcher Dev, can you tell us a little about Evan before you dive in?
So today I'm going to be speaking to Evan about his wonderful book, Into Every Generation the Slayer is Born, How Buffy Staked Our Hearts.
Were you born on the East Coast? Were you born in New York?
No, I was born in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, but East Coast, yes.
What was it like growing up for you?
Well, I mean, I kind of have like what I've come to realize is sort of story that I hear from a lot of young gay kids, which is that like, I just felt very other in the world. And also I grew up in like the 90s. So it was the beginning of social media, but it was not quite, prevalent. So whereas I think a lot of people today that are othered in any sense of the word can find community online. This was before that. So, I mean, like, I grew up at a time when there were message boards and chat rooms, but even that I was a little too young for. So discovering something like Buffy, I was able to sort of both sculpt my personality around the show, but also make the show my personality, make my love of it something that sort of guided my ideas of who I was. So I think I was just someone who was like very susceptible to fan culture. And now I think the fan culture is such a part of pop culture. But I think at that time it was a little bit more separate.
Juliet was very good friends with Anne Rice before she passed. Anne was so brilliant. Check this out. In 1975 or 6, she had a phone line that you could leave her a message. And if she liked the message, she would respond to the fan.
Wow.
She knew the power of her fan. And she had an assistant called Beckett, who was a lovely man, who was a Franciscan monk, who then left and went to work for Anne. It was an amazing story, but he did it through a phone call to her.
Wow.
She really understood that direct talking to the fans is a sort of power that is unimaginable. Right?
Yeah.
Will you talk about the first time you saw Buffy on TV?
Yeah, I mean, I remember I was watching TV with my mom up in the bedroom and it was like a commercial break. So I was flipping through the channels and I came across Buffy and it was season 2, episode 6, Halloween. So Buffy was in fact under a spell of playing somebody else. So Sarah Michelle Gellar had a brunette wig on, because she was playing, I think, like an 18th century maiden or something. And so I was like, what is this show? And at that point, Spike emerged and he was obviously a full vampire. I think I was like 9, at the time. And so my mom was like, turn this off. And I remember running downstairs, putting it back on and falling in love with the show right then and there. But I think it was like for the rest of that season, and I think even into season 3, I had to secretly go into the basement and watch the show because for my parents, it was vampires. They thought it was adult content. And again, different world we were in then, because nowadays I would think Buffy would be considered much less risque than it was then. But at the time, the idea of like a science fiction show on a teen network, I was way too young to my parents. But then after a while, once my parents eventually realized my love of the show, I think that they were kind of just allowed me to watch it with them and rather than have to do it in the shadows.
What was it in that moment? What did you see that spoke to you?
That's a good question. I don't even fully know if I know. I think I was drawn to the colors of the show. I think I was drawn to the speed of the show, the speed of the storytelling. And I think at that time, I don't know if I'd ever seen like teens on television, but I don't think my taste was sophisticated enough to say, oh, I was really drawn to the dialogue. I don't think that's what it was. I think it was just pretty people doing stunts, wearing cool costumes. I think I was really attracted to the visual language of the show. And then I think like over time, I started to develop a more discerning love of the things that many Buffy fans love about the show. But in the beginning, I think I just was like, oh, these are pretty people on television in action sequences that I like.
How did it affect your life?
I think it taught me a different way to speak because, I think many people have written about Buffy speak. I write about it in the book. There's just very unique language to the show. So I think as a writer, it taught me that, you can say something, but you can flip a word around or rephrase it in such a way to say it in a more interesting way. And that's something that like really stuck with me with Buffy from the outset. I mean, it's evident from the pilot episode of the show. And then I think Buffy did what I think other shows have done as well, but Buffy did a great job of it, which is that celebrating the outcast in a way and making the outcast triumphant. And the quote unquote cool kids were not in fact that cool. They were quite afraid and quite insecure. And so Buffy sort of dignified the idea of being other, which is, I think, part of its enduring legacy. And it's not just nerds. I think that was a faction of it, but just anyone who just feels like they don't fit in. Buffy celebrated that. They weren't trying to say, no, you do fit in. They were saying, no, you're correct in thinking you don't fit in. And yes, and that's a wonderful thing. And I think that had a great effect on a lot of the fans, consciously and unconsciously. And I think it's one of the reasons why we still talk about the show today.
Who was the first person you ever met from the show?
The first person that I met would be Sarah. Yeah, would be Sarah.
Well, is that the first time you interviewed her, which you talk about in the book?
No, it's a funny story. I was at a taping of Watch What Happens Live in 2017, and Andy Cohen is a mutual friend of Sarah and I. And so I was sitting in the front row because he was like, do you want to come? Sarah Michelle Gellar is going to be on. And I said yes. And then he turned to me during the commercial break and he asked me if I wanted to meet her. And I said no, because I had never wanted to meet her because, you know, they say don't meet your heroes. So anyway, so he introduced us then. And then we met, we hit it off that night. We kept in touch via email. And then there would be like professional opportunities that would come up. Subsequently, through staying in touch, I think we became friends. It took us a few years to legitimately call us friends. But yeah, I would say it began just through this chance meeting through a mutual friend. And then, yeah, I would say we're quite close now, which is a lovely thing.
Will we get a revised version of the book? Is there any chance that you're going to update it at all?
There are people like Juliet. David Boreanaz has subsequently said he would talk to me, and I didn't get him for the book at the time. So that could be really interesting. Allison is someone that was a yes, then became a no, that could potentially become a yes again. So I think I could be coerced into doing it if I had voices included that were previously unavailable or no's that became yeses. That could be the thing that would make me revisit it. So actually, as I'm saying that to you now, I'm kind of like, maybe for like the 30th or something. And like interviews with people like Juliet, David, Allison, Michelle, that could entice me.
I love how much research you did on the book. Can you talk about the process? You kind of talked about it. It's so well researched. I think you're probably a person who's painstaking in everything you do in terms of detail. I think you bought some things I'd never heard before. You know, when I'm married to Juliet, what was the research process like?
Yeah, the process was challenging in that it was obviously rewatching the episodes, right? And then obviously the interviews with the cast and the creative. The show was really before the internet. So there had to be a lot of digging into the Wayback Machine and trying to find interviews and things that were done at a time before there was the internet. So that was the difficult thing. And also having to go to the library and, you know, go through the card catalog in order to pull up some of these archival interviews. That was definitely one of the challenges.
What was the most interesting facts you found out about making the show from researching the book? What was the big revelation you got that you were like, oh, that's something no one's ever heard?
One of the things that really surprised me about the show was I just think how exhausted these actors were. And then also, mind you, these were 44-minute long episodes, 22 episode seasons. Today's television landscape is so different. I mean, a lot of television shows do 8, 10, 12 episodes and call it a day. And those will often be 22-minute episodes, 30-minute episodes. So I think the nature of producing this show at the scale it was produced, thinking about having to shoot at high school and thinking about the bronze and the graveyard scenes and shooting at night, this show was so expensive to make. Just thinking about the graduation day and the idea of like, we're going to blow up this high school and we're going to literally put explosives on this set. It's like today they'd be like, oh, no, CGI. And mind you, that episode contained CGI, but there were a lot of practical explosives in that episode. Thinking about the season 4, the penultimate episode, just with everything in the initiative and the amount of extras that were used, just the scope of this show is wild to me, especially when, again, comparing it to today's television landscape, which I think is so mindful about cost-cutting measures. That's one thing that really stays with me about the show.
One thing also, don't you talk about in the book on that third season at the end, that's the thing that got them thrown out of Torrance, right?
Yes. Yeah.
Do you want to just briefly encapsulate that story?
Yeah, I think for them, they were, at that point, they'd been working on that set for several years. And mind you, Beverly Hills 90210 shot there, multiple movies, including She's All That, had shot there. So Henry was used to having people using the facility. I would imagine they liked it to an extent, right? I mean, it was great PR for their school. And at the end of the day, it's like anyone, whether it be education or otherwise, press is good in terms of, you know, upping the reputation of the school. This was timed tragically, not timed purposefully, but the Columbine massacre had happened around the same time as season 3 airing. And so I think that the idea that they had not glorified it, but the fact that they were, showing off, you had the Earshot episode, which had the school shooting in it, and then you had Graduation Day, which had students literally bringing weapons and explosives to school. I think at that point, Henry might have been happy to have been involved with the show, but might have been ready to wipe their hands clean as far as saying, like, we don't want to make it look as though we are co-signing violence, which I don't think it was the case, but I think just as a cautious measure, they were kind of like, if we're going to be involved with the television show, maybe it shouldn't be something so violent. I think that was probably their thought process at the time.
Yeah. Can you take us through a list of the big bads and what they mean to you? Because I think they all kind of tie into her development as a character.
Well, it's interesting because I think the Master was not fully developed to be a big bad in sort of what became the standard for the show. I think the Master really introduced the idea of the big bad can be funny. Evil is not just as simple as good and evil, but that evil might make you laugh. Evil might entertain you. Evil might have their own hopes and desires. And so I think the Master sort of helped set the tone of the humor of the show in a way, in that you weren't just rooting for Buffy to defeat the Master, though you were kind of like, oh, this guy's funny. I like when he's on screen. And then I think with Spike and Drew, I think that went even further, which is this idea of like, wow, these bad guys have their own interior lives. They have their own love story, their own desires, so much so that by the end of the season, when Spike teams up with Buffy, you find yourself as an audience member suddenly rooting for a bad guy because he's no longer the bad guy, because the previous good guy, Angel, has become a bad guy. I think it like muddies the water of who is good and who is bad. I think that's like what Spike and Drew and Angelus do. It's always funny when I'm talking about Buffy big bads, because it's like, who is the big bad? Because it's like, is Spike or Drew or Angelus the big bad of two? And then to bring that conversation to season 3, the mayor is technically the big bad, but Faith is the big bad ultimately. So I think with Faith, it was just this idea of it can come from within, right? It's like this idea of this sisterhood, this connection that Buffy feels with Faith, but the idea that Faith is the evil version of her other half. With Adam, I think it was sort of recognizing the role of technology and the military in all of this and sort of expanding the world of evil, not just being supernatural. And then with Glory, I think it took it a step further, which is to say, well, what happens when it's a god? Like, what happens when it's an entity that we are meant to worship? Obviously, with Adam and Jonathan, with Andrew, I think it became an idea of like, well, what happens when it's the guy next door? Or what happens when it's this person that you're walking past on the street, you bump shoulders with, and you have no idea that they actually have the capabilities? And I think coming off of Glory from season 5, it was like, wow, we went from a literal god to just Jonathan, right? Like this guy that she run into in the hallways for several years. And then I think with the first, I think the idea was taking it back to the very beginning, and the idea that evil is something that has existed for as long as there has been man.
That's some of my favorite work by Nathan Fillion. He's really good in the season. So he's really disturbing and powerful. And it's interesting, 6 I find a very disturbing season, because I think there's also like that refusal to grow up. Like, how dangerous is that to remain stuck in that childlike side of yourself?
Yeah.
We're very good friends with Greenwald, and I think David Greenwald is really good in that writer's room. We've kind of discussed the things you would like to add. Was there a lot of stuff that you didn't add, that was stuff that was kind of like a road that as an Uber fan someone would love, but you're like, it's not really germane to my story?
I mean, I think I could have done an exploration of the bad guys on the show, something exploring the varieties of bad guy from both the episode of the week to the big bad. I think I could have done something on Buffy's take on the bad guy as a concept and exploring the variety. That's something I think I could have done, that I would be interested in. You kind of encapsulated this in talking about the season, about the big bad. What are your favorite seasons of the show? My favorite season of the show is definitely season 3, just because I think the show just is cooking with gas at that point. I really, really like the relationships between Xander and Cordelia. I love the development of the relationship between Willow and Xander. Oz is one of my all-time favorite characters on the show, and I think that there is no character on television remotely like Oz. And I feel like you get obviously the most Oz in season 2. And I just sort of like the Scooby Gang is my favorite configuration of the Scooby Gang is in season 3. Faith is my favorite character of all time. I love what Wesley brings to the table. I love Joyce in season 3. I feel like the dynamics in the show are just my absolute favorite. But I would say from a scientific perspective, season 2 is the best season of Buffy. And then I would say third for me would be season 5. I think Sarah Michelle Gellar's performance in season 5 is her best work on the show. Incredibly underrated. I think she does such a terrific job of building Buffy from a young woman into an adult. There's so much about Sarah's performance that I don't think is properly celebrated, but I think her performance in season 5 in particular, and the way she sort of adjusts from becoming a big sister to a mom figure to Dawn is just tremendous. And I also think the development of Willow's queerness, which I think really takes shape in season 5. Yeah, I think season 5 is also terrific.
What's the most moving thing you got from a person coming up to you talking about your amazing book?
I think people really appreciated how in-depth I went with my love and appreciation for how groundbreaking this show was for its depiction of a queer character, multiple queer characters, and a queer relationship. I think that if there's anything about Buffy that is like the best thing about Buffy in 2024 by far, outside of the performances, which I think absolutely hold up, I think Buffy remains the gold standard for LGBTQ plus inclusion. It is remarkable how ahead it was at the time, and the fact that it's still today, it just was able to treat queerness as just run of the mill. I still am just so struck by that component of the show.
Oh, Juliet, do you want to just say hi?
Hi, Evan.
Hi.
I'm so excited that you're doing this.
I'm so excited to be doing it.
Yeah, you're so talented. I just overheard the last little bit. I can't wait to hear the whole interview.
When you get to talk to Juliet, you have to ask her about killing Kendra, because she has a great story about that. And I don't want to tell it. I don't tell it as well as her, but it's a really good story.
Yeah, I would
including
love to hear it.
popping nails.
And a concussion included.
And a concussion.
Oh my God.
Say thank you so much for doing this. I'm so glad that we are connected now as well.
Yeah, me too.
One of the things that we've experienced, because I sit with Juliet as she goes, the show is very well structured. Can you talk about structure? Because I think you talk about that a bit in the book, about how well structured the show is.
The big bad, obviously, I think is like the biggest structural tentpole of the show. But I think one thing that really discerns Buffy for a lot of fans is the idea that it had this big bad, but then it would have Monsters of the Week episodes interstitched throughout. And so I think it gave it the idea that if you were in it for the long haul, it would pay off. You would be rewarded for your loyalty. However, it was able to indoctrinate new fans very easily, because there would always be an episode where you could be like, well, just watch this episode. For instance, I mentioned the Halloween episode. My first episode is a great example of you don't need any context to the show to watch an episode like Halloween. So I think it did a great job of servicing this sort of like deep cult-like fandom kind of person. I would categorize myself among that sort of fan, but also a casual. So I think it did a really good job in that sense. But then I also think it did a great job of like long tail storylines. When we're talking about, for instance, Buffy in season 5, right? Which is this idea of, okay, she is going to be introduced to a sister during this season. So there's all of the psychological components of that. Her mother's sick. She's going to lose her mother. She's also dealing with coming into her womanhood. And I think the show was able to like speak to those larger themes, but weave them throughout the storytelling in the sense that obviously there are things as simple as, okay, well, she's got to kill this vampire, right? They were able to sort of take on the issues large and small. And also too, things like the first being introduced in season 3, but being the big bad in season 7. The show was really great at being very rewarding. The fact that Faith introduces the idea of Dawn a season before she arrives. Like there are all these little, I guess we would call them Easter eggs, but to me that they were ways in which the show sort of rewarded you for being a longtime fan and a loyal fan. And so I think that's something that you just don't get a lot of on television. That is one of the reasons why people love the show.
Why did you like Faith so much? What was it about Faith that spoke to you?
I loved what she did to Buffy. I love this idea of Buffy being this person who was so sure of who she was, both as a teen and also as a slayer. And I just love the idea of this like force crash landing into her ether and upending both of those concepts, right? Like you see it from the get-go. It's both Faith's fighting style and her love of slaying, but it's also the way that Faith immediately is able to become this fascination amongst the Scooby Gang. And so it's like this force comes in and just eliminates the stability from the lead character in a way, but also is like this powerful enigmatic force to the character. And so again, my love of Faith really is what she did to Buffy, because Buffy is my other favorite character. And the way that Faith was able to destabilize the character of Buffy, I've never seen anything quite like it. And Eliza's performance, I mean, unparalleled, but I'm drawn to the character of Faith, but also the idea of a Faith, this force that comes in and completely upends your idea of who this character is.
Did you ever have a Faith in your life?
I didn't have a Faith in my life, but I would say my best friend had a similar-ish effect as far as like I had this idea of the world, and then I met this best friend and he expanded my idea of the world. I don't think in my instance he turned my world upside down the way that Faith did for Buffy, but yeah, I definitely have someone that has come in and changed my idea of the world.
One of the things in just talking with you, and another thought about this, is as each season expands, her world expands.
Yes.
So season 2 is like that period of your life where you may have been allowed out to go this far, but now you can go over here.
Yeah.
Harry Groner is an incredible actor.
Yes.
Why does Buffy keep growing as a show?
I think the queer fandom is a really big part of that. I think both people that love the depiction of queerness on the show, but also relate to the character of Buffy, which I write about in the book. This idea of like, I think queer people can relate to the otherness of the character of Buffy, her, having the secret of being a slayer and then having this coming out to her mom. So I think the queer fandom is a big part of that. There's something about Sarah Michelle Gellar with the internet. Like the internet loves Sarah Michelle Gellar. As someone that tracks, pop culture and pop culture conversations, I think there's a very rarefied space that someone like Sarah has. And I think people love her and want to see her succeed in ways that they don't. So I think Sarah is a big part of it. I think the accessibility of the show. I remember when the show would first air, it would be on television, Monday at 9 p.m. or Tuesday at 8. And once the episode was done, you wouldn't be able to find it again. Then we got lucky with the FX acquisition, where then I was able to VHS record the show. And then obviously the DVD came along. But I think with streaming and the accessibility of the show, I think that plays a big role in people's love of it. And I think just the fact that throughout all these years, it always ends up on television's best ever lists. And I think that creates intrigue from people. And I think it feels old enough that it has an archival appeal while also being fresh enough thematically and with actors that you recognize that it balances feeling old school, but not Cheers. I think it still has like a shininess about it.
We're very good friends with a bunch of the people from True Blood. I also think it's because people will watch it with their children and their grandchildren now. Like, it's a myth, isn't it? It's a fairy tale. It's the hero's journey exemplified is Buffy, right? What are you working on now?
Currently, I am getting ready to host a podcast for a very beloved HBO show that is returning. So I'm getting ready to do that. And I host a Survivor podcast called Drop Your Buffs. So I'm continuing to watch. You asked earlier about if I have another book in me. I would love to do an oral history of Survivor. That would be something that could bring me around to doing another book. So I'm continuing to do that. And yeah, those are my big things on the docket.
Where can you get the book?
I hate to give a plug to Amazon, but Amazon really is the easiest place to get it. But if you Google Into Every Generation a Slayer is Born, if you Google the title of the book, I believe it'll take you to the publisher's landing page, which has a link which includes some more smaller bookstores. If you have a local bookstore, it's carried at most bookstores.
See you soon when we'll do it again. Do it again. Until next time, rewatch, revamp, reinvent, and be remarkable you.